And is it really compassionate to say to a person, I don't believe in you, you are a victim, here's everything you need, and oh, by the way, there is a very good chance you'll be dead in a year. And is it compassionate to their families, friends? Is it compassionate to the larger community that has to pay for all of that? I ask you and anyone listening to this podcast, is that truly help? Or are we just trying to say, out of sight, out of mind, and I feel better about myself because I'm getting this person off the street, even though they're going to die?
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the Lonely Podcast. In this episode, I'm going back to the issue of homelessness in America and I'm discussing with Mr. Paul Scudo. Paul is the current CEO of STEP Denver, which is an organization that provides recovery and rehabilitation services for men suffering from the disease of addiction, as Paul describes it. Beyond his professional credentials, Paul's personal story puts him in a position to be highly qualified for that job. Paul also suffers from the disease of addiction and lived on the streets of Denver for a period of 2 years until he started his recovery. In our conversation, we discuss the current homelessness crisis in Denver and throughout the United States, whether today's drug availability and potency make the situation even worse than it was before. What are the root causes for homelessness? What is the compassionate thing to do in terms of policy to treat homelessness? What is STEP Denver's policies and rehabilitation methods, their measure for success, and much, much more. Paul was gracious enough to host us in his office and share his personal story and thoughts about this crisis. For his honesty and openness, I am truly grateful. So, without further ado, please welcome Paul Scudo. I guess one of the things I wanted to start, first of all, I would say thank you so much for coming on, the program and taking the time and hosting us here. It's really great. And again, the goal here is to really provide different perspectives and kind of dig into this issue of homelessness in America. It's the title. And you have a very unique personal story, so I would like to start with that. If you can share, first of all, what are you doing today and how did you end up doing that? Like, what is the origin story here behind that? It would be great.
Sure. Thank you again for allowing me to be a part of this. I'm grateful and humbled that you would take my story and opinion into consideration. My name is Paul Scudo. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of STEP Denver. STEP Denver is a men's residential addiction recovery program, long-term program here in Denver. And it is a program that gives men with nowhere else to turn the opportunity to overcome the consequences of addiction, like homelessness, through a program that's based on sobriety, work, and accountability. So how did I get here? That's a great question. I will try to sum it up quickly. I was raised in an upper middle class family. There was no drinking, using, trauma, abuse, mental health issues. I was afforded all of the opportunities of that upbringing and was raised with very good values on work and ethics and integrity, and started using drugs and alcohol with my peer group the way many people do. And I am an individual that suffers from the disease of addiction. I have a genetic predisposition that when I put drugs and alcohol into my body, a chemical process begins that supersedes the ability for the prefrontal cortex's ability to make logical and rational decisions. That disease is chronic and progressive in nature, so I was able to manage it for a very long time. College educated, married, great job with a Fortune 500 company, owned a home, lived a fantastic life. But as my drug and alcohol use progressed, I began to suffer those consequences. I got a divorce. I began to lose jobs. I was arrested for the possession of drugs. I eventually lost another job. I had no money. I lost my home and ended up being homeless for 2 years. My only goal every day was to collect $3.85 to get a bottle of vodka to blot out the misery that was my existence, because I could not understand why someone that was afforded every opportunity in life, was very successful at so many other things, could not stop using drugs and alcohol. And I tried over a 10-year period as I watched these consequences pile up. So when friends found me, put me into treatment, I was exposed to a peer recovery community and the 12-step process. I went to treatment for 90 days and then lived in a sober living environment for a year. During that time, I volunteered at the treatment center that I was a part of. And during that time, went back and got my education in addiction counseling. I was eventually hired by that treatment center to be a counselor there and worked there for 3 years. I was recruited away by this organization to come and build a program, the program that we may talk about today. And over the course of the first year, built that program, implemented that program, began collecting data on that, and we saw very, very good success. Eventually, the executive director that hired me left to pursue other opportunities, and because I had lived experience, addiction education experience, I had built the program here, and I had 27 years of business experience prior to getting into this industry. The board of directors decided that I should be the next executive director. Just recently, we have collected enough data to show that this model works. We have talked to people across the state and around the country that have expressed an interest in bringing this model to their community. So the board promoted me into the chief executive officer role so that I can focus on growing this model and bringing these principles into other communities moving forward. So that's the short version.
Yeah, so thank you very much for sharing this. I would like to ask you a few questions on that. I would say, first, can you talk about the rationalization aspect of addiction? Because in a previous conversation, you mentioned that at the beginning, when you started using alcohol and drugs, you were rationalizing in a certain way, and after a certain point, you started using it for you started using it to block those rationalization. Like you mentioned, you said, how come someone like me who grew up with all these opportunities end up in this situation? So I wanted to ask about this rationalization, like how do you rationalize that? And at what point you just can't rationalize it anymore? What was the pivotal moment for you?
Sure, great question. Human beings in general try to make sense of what they do, their decisions, their choices, actions, and behaviors. So when I started using drugs, it was a peer bonding experience. I liked the way it felt. It brought me closer to my friends because we were having shared experiences. Additionally, within our society, there is this glorification of drinking and using as a way to enhance the fun that you're having. It, in many cases, is deeply ingrained in the social fabric of society, and it seems like everyone's doing it, right? So that's the initial rationalization. I'm having fun. It feels good. I'm bonding with my friends. It's accepted in society, and everyone is doing it. But for those of us, the 20% of us that have a genetic predisposition to the disease of addiction, that doesn't stay at a particular level. It's progressive in nature, my use increases, and correspondingly, the consequences of that use begin piling up. Because as human beings, we're mammals, we're pack or herd beings. We want to be in groups, whether that's family, friends, work, clubs, other societal organizations, right? We have a need to want to be a part of, valued, and loved. And as my behavior gets worse and worse in a corresponding manner with the amount of drugs and alcohol I'm using, I begin doing things which are now not societally acceptable, right? And that makes me ashamed, embarrassed, humiliated, right? But because I have this need to have you still want to love and value me, I use that rationalization as a defense or a coping mechanism, right? And I begin lying or manipulating or blaming. And this is what we have begun to see in our society, is this blaming, right? This victim mentality. It was this or this or this person, my parents, a teacher, a boss, a judge, the cops. It's my mental health. It's my trauma. It's abuse. It's the economy. It is the cost of housing. It is insert reason here why it's not me, because while addiction is becoming more widely understood and accepted, there is still a general stigma that surrounds that people say it's a choice, or you need to use your willpower, or you need to be stronger, or you need to just stop. And that's just not the case for people that suffer the disease of addiction. And before I understood that and understood the solution, I wanted to blame or make excuses or lie about things to rationalize to them being my family, friends, coworkers, and to myself, because I just couldn't understand why I was doing these things.
And what was the moment that you stopped blaming? Did you started taking responsibility? Because you mentioned that you were sent to jail at one point.
On
several points, sorry. So can you maybe talk about that, and what was for you personally, what was the point that made you understand, okay, it's on me, I need to take responsibility here?
So the first time I was arrested, I was very defensive, right? I'm an upper middle class business person. I pay my taxes. I work really hard, right? I just got unlucky, right? That's the key rationalization. I'm unlucky. But I was afforded an opportunity to go through drug court. I wasn't thrown in jail immediately. And they said, all you need to do is stop using, go to these drug and alcohol classes, do some community service, pay your fine. If you do that over a course of a year, then the felony will be off your record, right? And I could not stop drinking and using. And that is the first time I began wondering, right? Is this my fault? And I couldn't understand why, right? And so internally, as I would get arrested again for having a dirty UA or missing court or not showing up at classes, that's when it began to set in that this was really about me. It wasn't anyone's fault. And the rationalization pivoted from, it's not someone or something else's fault, was my fault, but I couldn't understand why, right? So the rationalization became, I'm unlucky. Life is unfair. I must just be weak. I'm unethical. I'm immoral. I make bad choices. I am a bad person. When in fact, it was also none of those things. It was the disease of addiction and the chemical process. Yet I still wasn't at a point where I had learned about and understood that.
So what would you say to people who are not suffering from the disease of addiction as you described? You said it's 20% of the population. So is it fair to assume that some of the people who develop addiction are not suffering from this predisposition? And if so, how would you rationalize or help them make their life better, I would say, in terms of taking accountability and responsibility for their decisions?
So an individual will know at a certain point whether they can or can't stop, right? And those people that cannot stop, in 99% of the cases, have the genetic predisposition to have the allergic reaction to mind-altering substances. So there are some folks that might drink or use recreationally, and maybe they drink a little too hard, they use a little too hard, and they have an initial set of consequences. Usually, those consequences are enough at that point to make them stop or moderate to a point where they're not behaving in a way that generates these consequences. So there's really nothing you need to say to them. Then there is a second set of folks, and it's usually around alcohol. And we call these people functional alcoholics. That while their behavior is detrimental to themselves and their family, it is not so detrimental that they begin to have consequences like getting terminated from employment, getting arrested, losing their home, whatever that might look like. Those folks usually don't come to some sort of awareness until later in life when they begin having physical repercussions. And their doctor tells them this is a direct result of your drinking and you need to stop drinking, right? And then there is this third class, people like me that begin having consequences, try to fight through the consequences for a long period of time, rationalizing it away, or even if we accept it, I'm an addict, I can't stop, I don't know what to do, and I accept that, and I try to navigate life around my addiction until I can't anymore. Those are the people that in some cases you can stop earlier on when they have a set of initial consequences that are serious enough that you can point to those, share your own experience, and hopefully they're willing to do some work around that. But in many cases, those people are stuck in the rationalization or blame game because they're embarrassed, ashamed, humiliated, and they don't want to stop using because they can't picture at this point a life of not using, or they can't picture at this point what it will take to stop using and then overcome the consequences that have built up and rebuild their life.
And what about, okay, so another question, I guess these are two questions that I want to ask, okay? Because your story, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that, did you start the rehabilitation process around 10 years ago, 2011 or something like that? Around that?
13, almost 13.
13 years.
It will be 13 years on February 17th.
Okay. What is different today? Like, from your perspective, what do you see? The people who come here and ask for help, what is different between their situation and your situation at the time, 13 years ago? And I am asking this because we all know about the opioid crisis and how people got addicted on Oxycontin. It was very, they were prescribed Oxycontin from their doctor after they went through, to the dentist for some sort of a treatment or something like that. And sometimes it was that difficult. Sometimes sometimes it was that minor. Sometimes it was more severe surgery that they went through. But that led a lot of people down the road of developing addiction to heroin and other drugs. One of the things that I understand today is that the potency of the drugs that are on the streets, whether it's P2P, methamphetamine, or fentanyl, is so powerful that even if you are not predisposed to develop addiction, it is you can develop, psychosis and stuff and other mental illness just by as a consequence of your use of these type of drugs. So I guess my question is, do you see a difference? And that's a very long kind of build up for that. But do you see a difference, and do you recognize anything that is different today than it was at the time when you were starting your recovery?
Yeah, that question is also very broad,
right?
Because you're touching on a few different things: societal norms, availability of substances, and the potency of those substances.
I guess the question, to try and pinpoint it, some of the things that we see today that are very frequent on the streets were not available 13 years ago. And I guess my question to you is, the availability of those very potent drugs, do you see a difference from, again, what you've experienced and from what other people are experiencing today?
I guess my answer to that question is no, and it's not the societally acceptable answer. Society is wanting to look at and point at a reason why we have these problems, and they call them crises. Well, the crisis started with alcohol, and we tried prohibition in the 20s. Then the crisis was marijuana in the 50s. Then the crisis was the hallucinogens in the 60s. Then the crisis was cocaine in the 70s. And then it was crack in the 80s. It was the designer drugs, ecstasy, ketamine in the 90s. It was meth in the 2000s. It was the opioid crisis in the 2010s. And now it's the fentanyl crisis, which is an opioid, in the 2020s. Have the drugs gotten more potent? Yes. But the disease of addiction, the homeless problem, the overdose issue has always been there. It hasn't been as front and center, and that brings me back to the societal norms, right? Outside our door, you see the encampments with people shooting meth and fentanyl. But 30 years ago, you saw the same mess out there, but it was alcohol and heroin, right? They called this the war zone. This was Skid Row, right? And there has always been addiction and always been homelessness, but it has been more hidden, right? The alcoholics lived out in the woods or under the bridge, or they were hobos riding the rails, moving from community to community, because you couldn't stay in any one community for too long because there was more societal pressure, right? And that societal pressure has eased off as we become a more compassionate society, right? We've decriminalized the possession of drugs. We've decriminalized public defecation and urination. We've decriminalized trespassing, shoplifting, burglary if it's not violent, right? We are allowing homeless camps to be here, and we just move them along. In the past, these folks had the threat of criminal consequences, and that in some cases, reduced or moderated the consequences of addiction or the outward exposure of addiction, i.e. homelessness. But now those things are looked at differently, where in the past they were unacceptable and that behavior was unacceptable. Now there is a compassionate victim narrative. It's not their fault, right? And so, yes, the substances have gotten more potent. They are more dangerous. And we see a corresponding increase in overdose deaths. But in the past, those overdose deaths weren't as evident. We weren't looking for them. They were in back alleys, in hotel rooms, out in the woods. They were in someone's basement, and nobody said anything about it. It didn't make the news. But today, it is much more front and center because of the homeless situation. We're beginning to connect the disease of addiction as a part of homelessness, right? But actually, in most cases, 70% of the cases, it's the driver of homelessness. Homelessness is a symptom of addiction, right? So the short answer to your question is yes, it's different. When I was deep in my addiction and homelessness, I hid because I was afraid to be seen. I was afraid to get arrested, right? And I was looking for places to stay warm, to stay sheltered. The difference today is because addiction and homelessness are so much more widely tolerated, right? There is more access to drugs and alcohol on the street. We are seeing more homelessness and we are seeing more death, right? And there isn't the motivators of temperature, food, and criminal consequences.
Yeah. You talk about compassion, but one can argue that it is not compassion.
You're absolutely right.
To let people live like that. So can you maybe touch on that point exactly of compassion? What do you mean by that exactly? And what is compassion to you? What is the compassionate thing to do with when it comes to dealing with folks like that?
So I'll take a step back to when you asked about my use and my criminal engagement, right? At a certain point, my family and my friends cut me off. I had gone to jail at this point more than a dozen times, and I was afraid of going to jail again. And as a matter of fact, had fled a situation, police contact, where I knew I was going to get arrested and probably go away for a long time, right? So the consequences of it was cold outside, it was February, I was hungry because they weren't handing out food and clothing in tents and propane heaters. I was afraid of police contact and going to jail again. And these consequences left me with nothing. And at that point, I became willing to do the things I needed to do when I was offered help to get out of the miserable situation I was in. Cold, physically weak, tired, hungry, afraid of getting jumped on the street, and afraid of getting arrested and going to jail, right? And everyone that had cut me off did so because they couldn't tolerate my behavior anymore. And they knew if we keep enabling him, keep bailing him out, keep giving him money and things, keep supporting him, he is going to continue the life that he's living until he dies. right? So these consequences motivated me to get help. And ultimately, I look back and I feel like that was compassionate. I am grateful for what those people, including the legal system, did for me, because my life today is so much better than it was even before addiction took everything away. And I have the opportunity to help people. And I've rebuilt relationships with my family and friends. And those relationships are better than they were pre-addiction, right? Our idea of compassion today is to say that person is a victim. It's not their fault. And almost in 100% of the cases, it's not their fault. They're not responsible for having the disease of addiction or growing up in a bad environment or getting abused or being a part of traumatic situations. Yes, it's not their fault. And sometimes life isn't fair. And am I going to live in a victim mentality? Or am I going to say, or are we going to say, that is a shame. Let us offer you help and services, but you have to be responsible for putting in the effort, putting in the work, being engaged, right? Meeting us more than halfway to work to get yourself out of, to manage your disease, to overcome the challenges in your life, to be a better person and have a better life. But no, we don't say that. What we say is that person's a victim, and we're going to give them this, give them that, and we're not going to expect them to do anything. And the subtext of that, Evie, is we're telling the person, we don't believe in you. We don't believe you can do it. We don't believe you have the ability to rebuild your life. So we're going to take care of you. And we're going to say, whatever you need, we're going to take care of at the cost of the community, right? We're going to put you in a home, but we're not going to have any expectations that you don't drink or use, that you get a job, and that there is an off-ramp to us paying for your housing, your food, your clothing, and your medical care, right? And thus, many people, and I'm sure Tom Wolfe told you these statistics of the number of people that were put into housing in San Francisco that died alone of overdose or physical health issues as a result of addiction. That 67% of all overdoses in San Francisco occurred in those housing projects, right? And at what point is it economically unsustainable that we're going to provide housing, food, medical care for these people with no expectation they're ever going to leave it? The next year, there's a new set, and we're paying for that set. The next year, we're paying for a new set, and there are the previous two sets, right? That's going to compound over time. When does the money run out? And is it really compassionate to say to a person, I don't believe in you, you are a victim, here's everything you need, and oh, by the way, there is a very good chance you'll be dead in a year. And is it compassionate to their families, friends? Is it compassionate to the larger community that has to pay for all of that? I ask you and anyone listening to this podcast, is that truly help? Or are we just trying to say, out of sight, out of mind, and I feel better about myself because I'm getting this person off the street, even though they're going to die?
Yeah, I totally agree that when last time we discussed, I called it, it's basically facilitating euthanasia.
Correct.
Because what happened is, and I think a lot of people with good intentions, either they ignore the truth or they just rationalize it in a different way. I've read some folks that say, when confronted with the fact that 20% of the homeless individuals in San Francisco that were put in housing died within the next year or two, they said, well, at least they died in the comfort of their home. Which to me is
that compassionate?
Yeah, it to me is not compassionate. To me, it's immoral to think like that, because there's a human being, and every human being has a story. And in Judaism, we say, "He who saved one life saved the whole world," which means that a person is equal to the whole world. So when you think that by putting someone in a house and literally letting them die within a year or two and facilitate their because you facilitated their addiction, to me, yeah, it's a slow way of, it's basically you're euthanizing the person, and it's immoral. And
I would ask those people that said that, what if that was your daughter?
Exactly.
What if that was your son?
Yes.
What if that was your dad? Would that be acceptable? Would you be okay with saying, well, at least he died in the comfort of his home? Right? These are the people that respond in this way, and I don't want to generalize, right? Because I know they're at heart good people that mean well, that are misinformed. But there is a part of this that is selfish. I want to feel better about myself because I've evaluated what that person needs, and I'm saying that I'm helping, and that makes me feel better about me. Oh, the person died? Let's go back to rationalization. I'm going to rationalize by saying they died in the comfort of their own home, not freezing on the street. I ask you, if that was your daughter, would you feel the same way?
Yeah, I think that's a very fair question to ask the same folks who answer that way. I want to take a bit of a step back because we talked about a lot of things here, but I want to ask you a question. I asked Tom the same question. How would you define, what is the proper way to define homelessness? Meaning, what is the proper way? Because, various organizations have they use the various different terms and definitions. Some call it homeless, some unhoused. What do you think is the proper way to define this issue?
As an individual, I do not have an address in my name for housing that I'm paying for. Own a home, rent a home, share a home with a community of people. I literally am in that home because it's mine, right? So we have all kinds of new terms for homelessness. They're unhomed, they're housing challenged, housing deficient, right? We want to make it easier and softer. But to me, homeless is, I'm living on the street, I'm living in a shelter, I'm couch surfing at my friends, I'm living in mommy and daddy's basement, I'm in jail, and when I come out of jail, I will not have somewhere to go, right? I do not have somewhere where my things are, where I'm paying the bills, and I have an address in my name. We can call homelessness as many different terms as we want, and we can identify it in different gradients. But if you're homeless, right? And us saying to people that are homeless or to other people trying to evaluate homeless what the definition should be, we're doing a disservice to the people without a home, without their own home.
Okay. And we talk about this, and I would argue, and a lot of other people would argue, that this is a crisis that you have. It doesn't, well, from anecdotal observations, when you walk in some areas of Denver, some areas of San Francisco and other major cities, it appears that this is something that is out of control and it's a crisis. But I want to ask you if you can talk about how would you determine if it's a crisis, and if so, how would you determine that?
To me, a crisis is something that affects the community at large, right? COVID was a crisis. The housing drop in 2008 was a crisis. This is a crisis not because of the individuals who are suffering homelessness because of their addiction. It's a crisis because the community has taken away the social norms, folkways, mores, and laws that have kept that in check for thousands of years. There will always be a percentage of people in a community that suffer the disease of addiction and are unhoused, right? But usually in the past, those people were hidden, right? Because it was unacceptable to be on the street this way. But now, because again, we've decriminalized, we've relaxed, we've termed them victims, this now allows them to be front and center on our streets, in front of businesses, on the right-of-way sidewalks, on the public transportation, in the parks, at school playgrounds. And it's beginning to affect the other community members. The cost, the exposure to people using drugs and alcohol blatantly out in public defecation, public urination, trespassing, shoplifting. You see dozens of people storming stores because they know there are not going to be any consequences, right? You see people panhandling because there's not going to be any consequences. People sleep in front of businesses, shoot up in the McDonald's bathroom. It's a crisis because it's affecting the average citizen. It's not more than it was. It's just more evident than it was. No, let me retract that. It's become more now because it's become easier to get by. So those numbers have grown. When in the past, societal pressure or legal pressure would have got a person on the road to recovery, they now don't have to get on the road to recovery. So there is a higher corresponding percentage of the number of people, right? But it's a crisis because it's affecting you, your family, your business, or transportation, or public right-of-way, the parks, right? It is now easier to see. The media is paying more attention to it. So now it's a crisis.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask your thought so I recently talked with some folks who run NGOs that help homeless who live on the streets, whether it's to help them with laundry services and
Portable showers.
Yes, portable showers, etc. And these folks mentioned that basically Denver, because it has such a robust system of healthcare and services that they provide homeless, that it attracts other folks from other states to come to specifically Denver. And I know that is the case also in California. Now, some can say it's the weather, some can say, other things, but there are factors in play, such as, there are factors like the services that these homeless provide. For example, Tom and I had a conversation with him. He mentioned that just by registering, just by going to ask for, I think, healthcare in the city of San Francisco, you can get, if you declare that you're a homeless person, and you don't even need to provide any information for the first few months, you immediately get food stamps that you can then go and sell on like 50 cents on the dollar. So do you think that the city of Denver how do you think the city of Denver should deal with that? With the fact that it has services that are so robust, which on the one hand we want to assist, we want to help the individuals who live on the streets, but on the other hand, it actually it attracts other people from other states. How do you think what are your thoughts about that, about this fact, and how do you think the city should respond to that?
That's kind of a two-part question, so I'll answer it. Yes, I believe that cities like Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, LA, Denver, cities that have very robust services and continue to increase their annual budget to provide those services do attract people from at least colder climate or more conservative cities. Yes, but I think that's only one part of it, right? The city is growing just because Denver is a great place to live. And as the city grows, 20% of those people are going to be addicts that come to the city, right? Whether they're suffering consequences yet or not. So eventually they're going to hit the street, or they're going to start accessing those services, right? Also, the city itself is going to generate individuals that suffer from the disease of addiction, regardless of whether they're transient or they were indigenous, right? It's easier to function in this city accessing those services and remaining homeless and remaining in the cycle of addiction. So that number is going to naturally, inherently grow, even if it was just our indigenous numbers, right? Yes, there is some transient population that adds to that. So yes, it is the services. Yes, it is the weather. Some of it are natives. Some of them are transients. But I would ask you what all of these cities that have the homeless crisis in common have in common, right? Do you ever hear about the homeless crisis in Raleigh, North Carolina, or Atlanta, or Tampa, or Omaha, or Dallas, or, right, some of these other nice warmer weather cities, right? Knoxville, Nashville, New Orleans. You don't hear about this and see the images on the news the way you do about these other cities. These cities have a very progressive take on providing services and sustaining this victim narrative, whereas other communities won't tolerate that. They still have laws and social norms in place that discourage this and drive individuals to help before the population of homeless people explodes and becomes a crisis. So do we have a crisis nationally? I don't think so. Do we have a crisis in certain communities, and those communities get a lot of press? Absolutely.
So I said before, it's a good segue to ask you, what do you think is a proper solution, if there is one, or any type of policy that for example, the city of Denver or the cities that you mentioned should implement in order to actually improve the situation?
That's a difficult question, right? Different people respond to different modalities, but human beings at their core are motivated to change based on their life circumstances. And the more difficult your life circumstances are, the more willing you are to do things to change those circumstances. We inherently want to be comfortable. We inherently want to be safe. We inherently want to be, we want to feel good about our environment, right? And so for situations like this, the first thing I would say is we need to go back to a traditional set of standards for social norms, mores, and law. And I don't mean we go back to the 50s, 60s, and 70s where it was discriminatory and racial and, right? That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the basic rule of law, right? If you possess drugs, regardless of your color, you're going to jail. If you shoplift, regardless of your gender, you're going to jail. If you defecate publicly, regardless of your gender ideation, you're going to jail, right? And we need to stop handing out tents and clothing and food and services at a clip that increases on an annual basis, all right? We need to make using drugs and being homeless difficult, right? So that the option of not using drugs and not being homeless is a better choice, right? Or has less consequences associated with it. Like we talked about, someone that's caught up in the disease of addiction doesn't have a choice. But if you continue to enable that, they will continue using. If there are laws and mores and norms that force a person to stop using, that's when you can begin providing services. So I'm not advocating a person just goes to jail, right? Sending someone to jail and letting them sit there without giving them an opportunity for help first doesn't work. That creates a jailhouse culture, a jailhouse mentality, and we're just throwing money at housing people anyway, right? That's not the goal. The goal is rehabilitation in all senses of the word, not just criminally and not just substance use disorder, but help a person to rebuild their life so that they become productive and contributing members of the community. So that starts with, we're going to uphold the laws and we're not going to just provide free services should you choose to be homeless, live on the streets, and continue to use drugs and alcohol. So along with jail would come forced services, right? And by forced, I mean you're going to go while you're in jail through 90 days of substance use treatment. At 90 days, you would get a mental health diagnosis. Once your brain and your body are healed and your brain chemistry is back to baseline, when I can actually diagnose an individual and they're not still in lying, manipulating, blaming mentality, when they're not in survival mode, right? When they're not in making excuse mode, and when you can actually see, based on stable brain chemistry, whether or not they have a legitimate mental health issue. Because drug and alcohol use manifests itself as mental health symptoms. Using meth represents as bipolar. Alcohol and opiates represent as depression. Cocaine use represents as manic or ADHD behavior. You can't give someone a mental health diagnosis until that person is at a place where their mind and body are free of drugs and alcohol, their brain chemistry is stabilized, the neural pathways are being rewritten back into a normal state, and then you can make that assessment. But at the same time, right, for those folks that really don't have a mental health issue, which you're going to find are probably 80-90%, then you begin workforce and career development training in jail. You begin life skills training. How do I put together a budget, rebuild relationships with family and friends, make my bed, clean up after myself, do my laundry, navigate transportation? How do I use a calendar to plan out my schedule for the day? Things that many of us take for granted, but that folks that are living on the street may have never learned because they didn't have a family upbringing that taught them that, or they're far enough removed away from that, if they did have that upbringing, that they've forgotten, and those need to be relearned and reconditioned. Right? And then while I'm in jail, I begin work release. And I go out and I work a full-time job. And I come back to jail at the end of the evening. I have to open bank accounts, and we teach them how to do that. And we have to put money in savings, and we learn to budget that money. During this time, I can start rebuilding relationships with family and friends so that by the time I'm out of jail, I have healthy relationships with people that trust me, right? We teach them, all right, when you get your own apartment, these are the responsibilities you're going to have, right? You're going to have to open up utility accounts. You're going to have to grocery shop. So we're going to teach you while you're incarcerated how to purchase and prepare your own food, how to make a grocery list, how to navigate transportation to the grocery store, to medical checkups, to work, to family and friends. We're going to teach you what is required to keep a home clean, to do the other things, pay bills, insurance, right? All of the things. Again, we take for granted that these folks, I was one of those folks. I needed these life skills training. And luckily, the environment I lived in taught me that, right? It's not put a person in treatment and then kick them to the curb because they don't have a job. They haven't rebuilt their relationships. They have no transportation, don't know how to get transportation. At that point, they probably can't afford housing because they haven't saved up any money. If they get housing, they don't know how to take care of it. And this is going to cause stress, anxiety, fear. And I'm going to cope with that the way I've always coped with it. I'm going to go back to using drugs and alcohol. So all we do is perpetuate the cycle. The solution is a long-term forced solution that after about 6 months, these people aren't going to feel like they're forced because they're engaging in the community by working. You're allowing them to meet with family and friends. You're teaching them how to take care of themselves. And by the time they get out, they've built the outside support systems, particularly 12-step, and family and friends that are going to help them as they re-engage with the community. And they're going to have the financial resources and have learned how to budget their finances and save to be able to get into the community in a safe, stable fashion, right? So jail alone is not the answer. And this narrative we hear about, oh, we offer wraparound services. Yeah, you might offer them, but are they the right ones? Are they required? as a part of the help? Or can I just get a home and a food stamp and a Medicaid card, and you're going to give me clothing and you're going to subsidize my utilities? But you're not going to force me to learn to take care of myself. There's no off-ramp for the help. So again, I'll kind of harken back to what I said. You compound the cost and you compound the problem, right? Forcing individuals through consequences to seek help and have that help truly be comprehensive, right, is the only way, in my estimation, that the problem's going to be solved. And you're going to hear the narrative. There are many pathways to recovery. Every individual is unique and they respond to different modalities. Humans at their core are humans, and we all need the same basic attention. Can we be culturally responsive? Yes, on the back end, right? The disease of addiction does not discriminate by color, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic upbringing, religion, education. Addiction is addiction, and it brings you down to basic human needs. I need to learn to take care of those basic human needs, and then towards the end, then we can be culturally responsive, socioeconomically attentive, as those people are going to move back into those cultural communities, those socioeconomic communities, those whatever it looks like. You've got to get a person able to take care of themselves before they can think of any of that other stuff. It's basic human nature. No, we're not robots. Yes, everyone's unique. Yes, we need to be sensitive to where people came from, and we cannot discriminate, but we also cannot make all of these programs that speak to a specific individual, but not talk about basic human needs and basic human values and basic human skill sets.
Okay. I think it would be interesting to hear about this organization, and provided what you just talked about. Can you explain what is it exactly that you do at Step Denver? You touched about it a little bit at the beginning. So I would say the first thing would be, what do you do here, and what are your objectives, basically, as an organization?
So what we do is we give men with nowhere else to turn, right? These are the individuals that have had all the consequences of addiction. They will not get help from family. They will not get help from friends. They are sick of living in encampments or in shelters, sick of going back to jail, sick of being hungry, tired, but most importantly, they're sick of how they feel in their core.
And these individuals come to you?
So, yes, we give them the opportunity to overcome these consequences through a long-term addiction recovery, career development, and life skills program, right? It's geared to go anywhere between 6 months and 2 years, dependent upon the individual. There are goals and milestones in each of the 4 phases geared to motivate and reward an individual as they achieve these things. And each one of these goals and milestones are built in a way that, as I just mentioned, we're preparing an individual to be self-sufficient and take care of themselves with a foundation in recovery, a full-time tax-paying job where they have learned to budget their finances and save money, but they've also learned the life skills, all of those things I mentioned earlier, that are going to help them transition as independent individuals back into the community. So our men come to us from a wide variety of referral sources, straight off the street, because the homeless community is very integrated and they know all the services, who does what, where I can get what, and usually after they've exhausted all the socially acceptable services we talked about, someone says to them, hey, if you're really ready, you should go to that step place, right? They come to us from detox, treatment, shelters, jail, probation, coming out of mommy and daddy's basement because they heard about us on the radio. They come to us from a broad spectrum of referral sources, but they all have one thing in common. None of them have an address in their name, and they're either on the street or they're about to be on the street.
And what is the process that you go through? With those folks?
So our program costs nothing. We don't bill Medicaid, insurance. There's no private pay. When you're ready for help, come on in. We take no government money of any type, no tax money of any type. All of our funding comes from individuals like you providing us a donation. It comes from corporations in the community that believe in our mission and our methodology. It comes from private foundations that are aligned with our mission. It comes from a vehicle donation program in which community members can donate vehicles. We sell those at auction, and all of that money comes back. So there are a few things that would keep an individual from being allowed into our program. If you're not willing to get off of government or third-party financial assistance, EBT, disability, SSI, check from your church, check from mommy and daddy, check from another nonprofit, you can't be on any third-party financial support. We're going to help you get a job. We're going to teach you to budget your money. We're going to teach you to save your money, and you're going to leave here with enough money to put a deposit on a place to live, deposit on utilities, purchase the things that you need for that independent living environment, right? So you can't be on any third party or government financial assistance. You can be on Medicaid because we are not a clinical or medical facility. We would never deny anyone health care. And you've been out there probably not having had any kind of a physical or mental health checkup, and we want you to go and get that, and you need Medicaid to do that because your body might be in a situation where you need a facility with medical services attached to it because there's something going on inside as a result of your drinking and using that requires medical attention. If you have any severe violence in your criminal background history, homicide, sex crimes, crimes against children, or a pattern of assault, abuse, or domestic violence, everybody comes in with an assault or a DV as a result of their use, right? Resisting arrest, I harassed my girlfriend on the phone, I got in a fight at a bar, right? But when we look at your criminal background, and it's assault, DV, assault, right? That indicates a need for a higher level of clinical anger management care, right? Homicide, sex crimes, crimes against children, that also indicates a need. And because we were transitional housing, we're not allowed to have a housing permit if we are housing those people without medical and licensed therapeutic care. Otherwise, come on in. If you want help, we want to help you. The final thing is you cannot be on any mind-altering substances that can produce euphoria or are physically addictive, including medically assisted treatment like methadone or buprenorphine, Suboxone, Sublocade, Subutex, right? because I can abuse those and they're physically addicted. We take other forms of MAT, naltrexone, Vivitrol, Antabuse, things that I would take in quantity and not get addicted to, and they will never produce euphoria, so they are not mind altering. Mood altering, things like mental health meds, Zoloft, Wellbutrin, absolutely not a problem. Heavy psychotics, we can't deal with those either because those require medical and clinical attention. And usually that means that person has a mental health issue that is legitimately above our ability to deal with. Psychosis, schizoaffective, multiple personality disorder, right? You have anxiety, you have depression, you have bipolar, come on in. Because in 90% of the cases, once you've been here for a few months, you realize I don't have that. It was a result of my addiction, and I was misdiagnosed, because that's its own complex too, its own industrial complex. We need to diagnose so that we can prescribe, and so that people have to have counseling and appointments, and that generates business, right? Not that I'm saying there aren't people with those legitimate issues, but those people are a small fraction of the population we're dealing with, right? But it's part of that victim mentality and that narrative we've created to make excuses for why those people are homeless, right? But in my experience, both working at a clinical facility, working at a non-clinical facility, and working with people in my 12-step community, most people don't have mental health issues. We've created mental health for pharmacy, counseling, and treatment reasons, right? So what else are we doing to help people, right? Those are the only things that would preclude you from coming in. Otherwise, come on in. So we're serving capable, competent individuals, but for the disease of addiction. And that's the majority of the people that are homeless. We're only serving men, which is the majority of the people that are homeless. So we're specializing. We're not trying to be everything to everyone. That's another reason we don't take the government money. Coming along with government money are strings. We're going to tell you who to serve, what demographics you have to serve, how many you have to serve, what your programming has to be. Then we're going to ask you to do all this reporting, right? You need whole departments to get that money, people dedicated to that. And you end up chasing the government grants. Hey, the flavor of the month is trauma. The flavor of the month is DEI. The flavor of the month is fentanyl. The flavor of the month is insert flavor of the month. And now I have to redo my program to chase that money so that I can keep funding it. We do what we do very well. We're going to continue to specialize in that. We're not going to change based on the flavor of the month, and we do it cost effectively. We serve 400 men a year. We have 22 employees, most of whom are graduates of our program. So we're doing this from a peer perspective. And our total budget is about $2.5 million, right? Extremely cost effective, outcomes driven, very effective from an outcomes perspective, right? So we're working on your addiction. We're building a foundation in recovery, addiction recovery educators, addiction programming, 12-step meetings, small groups discussing the 8 dimensions of wellness. But then our men are also working with our full-time career counselor, taking classes around how my addiction affects work, how the stress of work affects, and triggers me to want to use, right? How I need to show up as an employee now when I haven't done that in the past. Building a cover letter, resume, doing mock interviews, looking for work online, applying for work online, and then once they have a job, continuing to work with them on, now that I have a job and I've been there a few months, How do I get promoted in that job? Find a better paying job. Find a career-oriented job. 72% of our men find full-time tax-paying work within the first month. Most of them can't get a job within the first month because they don't have a picture ID or a social security card, and it takes the government upwards of 2 months to get them that. And then 100% are employed within 2 months. Then for those folks that come back and work with a counselor, last year 48% of them found a better paying career-oriented job before they left. As I mentioned, they have to put 20% of their gross income into savings so that they build up the necessary, prudent reserve to transition into the community and meet the cost needs of doing such. But it's more than just addiction and a job. As we talked about, we're trying to affect a behavioral change in the individual. So one of our core components is accountability. You are now responsible for your choices, actions, and behaviors. Everyone has bad breaks. Everyone has had things that in their life that is not fair. Are you going to choose to live in a victim mentality? Or with our help, are you going to say, all right, that's not good, and what do I need to do to get out of that and rebuild my life and cope with those things moving forward? How am I going to take personal responsibility for who I am, what I do, and what my life is like? And we give them the tools to do that. We hold them accountable. There are rewards when they do well and progress in the program, and there are consequences when they break rules or are not progressing in the program. And we're teaching them, you are responsible. You cannot lie, manipulate, or blame anyone anymore, just like it is in the real world. If you get pulled over for speeding, it's your fault. You were speeding. You're going to get the ticket and suffer the consequences, right? But we also provide them with life skills. How do I make a bed? How do I do my laundry? How do I purchase and prepare my own food? How do I be respectful to those that live around me? How do I budget my money? How do I find healthy social and recreational activities? How do I navigate transportation? How do I rebuild my relationship with my family? How do I be a good community member that is ready to reintegrate? Because I've been living in a selfish survival mode for so long that I've either lost the ability for that, and maybe my family never gave me those tools. Great. Again, life has bad breaks. You might have had a bad upbringing. Let us help you. And once we teach you, it's your responsibility moving forward.
So you said you help 400 people. Is that annually or?
Annually.
Annually? So just to, because I did the math very quickly. You said your budget is 2.5 million a year, I'm guessing? It's a year? Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. And with 2.5 million a year, you help treat 400 individuals. If you multiply that by 10, you get to 25 million a year, and you help 4,000 individuals. The current amount that the city of Denver spend on homelessness is beyond $200 million a year. So that is, I think, an interesting point to make, that I just wanted to make this point because, what you explain and the program that you provide people seem to be working. And I also want to ask you about how do you measure the success of it, but just on a budgetary, from a budgetary perspective here, it seems like it's very cost efficient as you described.
It's less than $6,000 a person.
Yeah, which is it's way less than what the current administration is spending and has spent in the past 10 years or so.
The Department of Housing and Urban Development has, through a study in a number of cities, shown that it costs a community, depending on the community and its problem, between $40,000 and $120,000 per homeless person.
Yeah, I believe that the University of Colorado Denver also did a study. I think it was in 21 that found the same. Basically, they conclude with the same. They reach the same conclusion. Sorry. So I guess the last question on this would be, how do you measure success? You did touch on that, but I want to ask, how do you measure and how sustainable it is long term? You have been a part of this organization for over a decade now. So what is success and how sustainable is it?
Again, I'll try to, a few different questions. Success.
Yeah.
Success is a nebulous thing, yes. Right? Different organizations define it in different ways. And the current buzz term is data-driven. We've got data, right? And the question I would ask is, who's collecting the data? What are the questions in the data? What are the answers self-reported? Are they observed? Yeah. Right? And what's your motivation for collecting the data? Because organizations spin data all the time to get to a particular outcome, particularly ones that are dependent on government funding, to make sure that the government sees them as effective.
Yeah, just on that point, most of the surveys that I've read about and the studies that determine the reason for homelessness are basically, these are self-reported answers. So people meaning homeless, they report that the reason for their homelessness is loss of employment, for example.
So let's talk about that. This population has learned the social narrative that I talked about earlier. So when asked, they have gotten extremely competent at parroting the social narrative. So you never hear about addiction, right? I lost my job. The very next question should be, why did you lose your job? Well, my boss was well, why was your boss right? And then I would be asking other questions. Why didn't you get another job? Right? Why didn't you have savings in the bank to prepare if you lost a job? Right? They're right, and not everybody can have a great job. There are people that work minimum wage, right? But there are thousands, tens of thousands of people that have minimum wage jobs that are not homeless, right? They live together. They live with family units. They live in HUD housing, Section 8 housing, right? They're very frugal with their money, right? If this is a crisis and we have a metro area of over 2 million people, and we're talking about 20,000 people that report homeless, mental health, trauma, cost of housing, the economy, right? And we're sinking $500 million into those 20,000 people. What about the other 1.9 something million that are living under the same conditions as this 20,000, but they're not homeless? If this was a real crisis, it would be 200,000. 10% of the population would report these issues. So I don't believe that the data that's being collected, I don't believe in the efficacy of that data. I believe the data is being collected and reported to have certain outcomes, to get certain money, so that certain people have jobs, and this homeless industrial complex continues. And that doesn't sound compassionate. I sound mean. I sound intolerant. I sound unacceptful, impatient. And that's not the case. I was that person. I am that person. I've made it my life's vocation to help people, not just as a profession, but in the 12-step rooms. I work with newcomers every day to help them. It's just my methodology and philosophy is different than the currently accepted social narrative. And the longer we do that, the worse the problem's going to get until the community finally gets fed up and says, this isn't working. If this was a corporation, the business would have been out of business years ago, or they would have pivoted their business model to be more successful. But the more money we've spent, the more compassionate we've gotten, the more overdoses there are, the more homelessness there is, and it's a self-perpetuating cycle, right? We need to pivot and try something different.
Agree. So going back to success.
Sorry, thank you.
No, it's okay.
I got off on the data thing, right? So we define success differently. First of all, you're never going to be able to put a number on helping one person because the ripple effect that has on that person's family, work, friends, and the overall community that they might help another individual, right? We value success as someone that is out of our program, not someone we've served, right? That is out of our program that we follow up with for a year. And they are sober, employed, and housed. And so we're able to get in touch with about 73% of the people that leave our program. And we believe that is because we build such a long-term relationship with them. You go seek services at a 90-day treatment facility, a shelter, the Coalition for the Home, case managers. We're not going to answer the phone when those people call. I don't answer the phone when my treatment center calls, right? I've moved on to a better life. That doesn't mean I'm not successful. It just means I didn't build a relationship with them. Here, we're building long-term, intimate relationships with these people. So they're willing to answer the phone, respond to an email, respond to a text. Of the 73% of the people that we're able to get in touch with, 82% are sober, 87% are employed, and 90% are housed. That is the number that we're looking at. But I have to be honest with you. There are a number of people that we discharge from our program unsuccessfully as a part of the consequences and accountability philosophy. We're not calling them. We immediately count them unsuccessful, even though they might be successful. I will see people we've kicked out of the program at my 12-step meetings, and they'll come up and go, you kicking me out was the best thing that ever happened, right? I got out there, I got miserable again, and I remembered what you taught me. And I did those things. And now my life is better than I would have expected. Is that successful? I think so, but we're not going to count that. That's spinning data. Because I could have come back and said, hey, add that guy to the list. We're not going to do that, right? We're only going to count the people we can count. And so, when you take that number and you divide it by the denominator of 400 people, the success rate as we define it, sober, employed, and housed at a year, is 30%. And you might say, God, that's a horrible return on my investment. Well, the national averages, as defined by SAMHSA, NADAC, NIDA, HUD, other organizations that do these surveys of people that enter into services and are sober a year later, is between 12 and 15%, right? So we're happy with our outcomes. Do we want them to be better? Yes. But the disease of addiction is insidious. It is the only disease in which the number one symptom of the disease is that it tells you you don't have a disease. I so desperately want to be normal. I so desperately want to be in control. I so desperately want to be like everyone else in my family or peer group, right? And the disease is going to tell me, you don't need to work the program anymore. You don't need to go to these meetings. You don't need to have a sponsor. You can go out to the bar with your friends. You can smoke a little weed. You can have a drink at Thanksgiving with the family. Everything's okay. And then I put the substances in, the process begins again, and I lose everything I built, right? So it's difficult for anyone that provides addiction or homeless services to keep someone sober for a year, because we're not keeping them sober. Our program isn't keeping them sober. We give them the tools. If they apply the tools, you have a 99.9% chance of being successful. If you stop applying the tools, you've got a very good chance that you're going to relapse and lose everything. It's like diabetes, right? I take my insulin, I check my blood sugar, I change my diet, I go to my doctor on a quarterly basis, I can have a very healthy life. I stop doing those things, I'm going to get sick again. The other outcome that we can definitely put a number on is the economic outcome. We just talked about the studies that show between $40,000 and $120,000 cost to the community. Let's be conservative and say that it's $40,000. Emergency services, medical services, police services, legal services, food, shelter, waste cleanup, whatever that looks like. That's a drain on the community. While our men are here, and once they leave the program, they're employed, sober, housed, and they make on average of $49,000 a year. And all of that money is being re-injected into the community. I'm paying taxes, I'm buying goods and services. Even if my money sits in a bank, the bank is lending it to better the community. So let's call that an $89,000 opportunity cost. Saving the community, re-injecting into the community. When we take that amount and we multiply it by that outcome number we talked about, last year, that was a $12.5 million economic impact on the community on a $2.5 million budget. So what's the return on investment there? We re-injected $12.5 million into the community at a cost to individuals like yourself of $2.5 million.
Yeah, that's a very good way to put it, I would say. To put those numbers together, I think it gives people a great image of the return of, if we can say, return on their investment.
That's what it is. A donor makes an investment in your program, hoping, believing that you're going to have outcomes, and believing, and people give to us because we don't take government money, because they believe what we're doing is more cost effective, but more importantly, more effective from an outcome standpoint.
Yeah. So last thing I want to ask, and after that we can wrap up. I know we're over time and you need to go, but I do want to ask if even despite everything that's going on, what you see on the streets and everything, do you have hope? And what are you hopeful for, I guess? That's my question. In terms of the future, do you have hope based on what you see? And even though the situation might seem very dire currently, do you still have hope?
Absolutely. I believe in the dignity of human beings. Human beings over the tens of thousands of years that we have been around have gone through way worse crises than these. And we have come together and we've overcome them, whether it's been physical, societal, COVID, whatever it might be, right? We have an ability to adapt, and we have an ability to adapt in a way that we support each other and we overcome things. Addiction will always be around, like cancer is always around. Diabetes is always around. What we need to do is moderate those things and provide the best solutions for them. Right now, what we have in our community is a difference in what we believe the solution is. And over time, different things will be tried, and the community will go, that's what works best, let's do that. It may take longer than we'd like for it to take, but people are basically good. They care. We want to help. We want a better community. And even the people that might believe differently than I do are doing what they do, coming from a place of wanting to help, of compassion, right? I believe that eventually that we will find a solution or a combination of solutions or a middle ground on the solution that ends up working. We've proven time after time that as human beings, we overcome challenges, we overcome obstacles, we overcome crises. Not only do I hope, I believe, I have faith, and I trust in the human being's ability to adapt.
Well, on that note, thank you so much. I appreciate your time and for everything that you do here. It's really incredible. I've been looking into this subject for a while, and it's very encouraging to talk to you and see and hear what you have to say, your perspective, and what you do here, which, you don't just talk the talk, you walk the walk. So it's I really appreciate it, and thank you so much.
I'm grateful, and I'm lucky that I'm able to do this. This isn't a competition. It's not about right or wrong. It's about helping people, and let's look at all the ways we can do it, figure out which way is working, and implement that methodology. I just hope, and thank you again, that through your platform, people will hear about a different methodology.